Let me be direct with you about what just happened over the past 72 hours. Because the way this is being framed in most of the media you are consuming right now is not just incomplete, it is deliberately misleading. You are hearing words like diplomatic friction, routine bilateral disagreement, basing rights negotiations, airspace protocol disputes. That language is not merely inadequate, it is the specific kind of framing designed to make sure you walk away believing nothing fundamental has changed. And that belief would be dangerously wrong. The Iraqi government did not file a polite request for modification of existing flight arrangements. They did not register a diplomatic note of concern. They issued an official binding blanket prohibition on American military aircraft using Iraqi-controlled airspace for offensive operations. This came through an official communique to the American embassy in Baghdad and a formal notification to the Iraqi Civil Aviation Authority, and they enforced it immediately by denying overflight clearances that had previously been granted as a matter of routine for nearly 2 decades. This is not a procedural disagreement, this is the formal withdrawal of the geographic foundation upon which American military strategy for the entire region, north and east of Jordan, has been constructed since 2003. Let that land. Without unfettered access to Iraqi airspace, every single flight path available to American aircraft conducting operations in the eastern Mediterranean, over Syria, into Lebanon, and toward Iran, becomes radically constrained. Not slightly inconvenient, strategically fundamental. The geometry of the region is not negotiable. Aircraft cannot fly through mountains. They cannot fly through countries that have denied them permission. And Iraq has now denied permission. Over the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this happened, what it means operationally for every American military contingency plan involving the Eastern Theater, why the Iraqi government made this choice, now who pushed them toward it, and why the collapse of this airspace access arrangement is best understood not as a standalone event, but as the visible capstone of a strategic architecture that has been eroding systematically for years. If you are not already subscribed, do it now, because this is the analysis that connects what happened in Baghdad to everything else you have been watching unfold across the region. The starting point is geography, because geography is the one variable that does not change no matter how many aircraft carriers you have or how many stealth bombers you own. Iraq occupies a central position on the regional map that cannot be bypassed. It borders Iran to the east, Syria to the west, Turkey to the north, and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to the south. It provides the most direct air corridor from the western part of the region to the Eastern Theater and from the Persian Gulf northward toward the Turkish and Syrian theaters. The American military has used Iraqi airspace continuously since the invasion in 2003. They used it during the counterinsurgency years, during the surge, during the withdrawal, and then the reinsertion for the ISIS campaign. During every single Syria operation, during every contingency planning round for operations in and around Iran, and during logistic support for American bases throughout the Gulf. The assumption that Iraqi airspace was effectively available for American military use became so thoroughly embedded in operational planning that challenging it was not even a scenario that received serious attention in public strategic analysis. That assumption is now operationally false as of this week. Here is the first thing the American media is not telling you. The Iraqi government's decision was preceded by a closed session of the Iraqi parliament, in which 47 representatives spanning Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish blocs voted to endorse a resolution instructing the government to enforce restrictions on American military activity that were originally agreed as part of a status of forces renegotiation back in 2021. Those restrictions had been implemented only selectively in the period since. But the existence of parliamentary consensus across the 3 major political blocs is the strategic detail that has been almost entirely missed in American coverage. This is not a Shia-dominated political decision driven solely by Iranian influence. Iranian influence is certainly present in Iraqi political dynamics, no question. But this decision has cross-sectarian political support. Sunni and Kurdish political representatives joined the resolution because they are responding to their own constituencies, which have their own reasons distinct from Iranian influence, to support restricting American military operations that they believe generate destabilization in their communities. That changes the entire diplomatic calculus. Washington cannot simply work around the Shia factions and find allies among the Sunnis and Kurds. The Sunnis and Kurds are already on board with the restriction. Here is the second thing the American media is not telling you. The American response has been remarkable for what it has not said. The State Department spokesperson described the situation as ongoing discussions with the Iraqi government about the parameters of security cooperation and expressed confidence that the bilateral relationship was strong and would accommodate resolution of any specific disagreements. Now note carefully what that language did not say. It did not say the airspace restrictions were invalid. It did not say the United States would continue operating as before. It did not say the restrictions were inconsistent with American rights under any bilateral agreement. The omission of all three of those statements is itself a statement. It is an admission buried in diplomatic language that the American government understands the Iraqi government's action is legally and politically defensible under existing agreements, and that Washington does not have a strong rejoinder. That is not weakness in the sense of incompetence, that is structural reality. Iraq has sovereignty. They have the legal right to control their airspace. And the agreements Washington signed over the years never guaranteed unlimited offensive overflight. Now let me get specific about the operational impact because specificity matters. The most direct routing from American bases in the Gulf region to targets in the Iranian theater passes through Iraqi airspace. That is just geometry. The alternative routing over Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and through the Jordanian and Israeli overflight corridor adds flight time and fuel consumption in ways that reduce payload capacity, reduce loiter time for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, and increase logistical complexity in ways that compound under sustained operational tempo. For a single strike mission, the routing change is manageable. For a sustained campaign, which is what any serious conflict with Iran would require, the routing change imposes costs that accumulate mission after mission. The F-35 aircraft that form the most advanced element of American tactical aviation in the theater have a combat radius of approximately 0 kilometers without aerial refueling. The alternate routing requirements, depending on the specific target set, push the operational requirement toward the limit of that radius or require aerial refueling assets that are themselves finite and that create additional risk and logistical complexity. According to analysis published by the Air University's Journal of Strategic Studies, quarterly operational planners estimate the effective reduction in available strike mass against deep targets in the alternative routing scenario at somewhere between 20 and 35%, depending on specific target location. That is not a trivial degradation, that is a potentially campaign-altering constraint. Here is announcement number 3, and this is where the story widens considerably. The Iraqi airspace decision is not an isolated action. It is coordinated with a series of parallel actions by other regional actors that together constitute a systematic narrowing of the geographic and political space available for American military operations in the entire Eastern Theater. The coordination here is critical and it has not been adequately reported. In the same week as the Iraqi airspace notification, the Jordanian government issued a statement clarifying that it would not permit its territory to be used as a staging ground for operations against Iran. The statement was framed diplomatically as a statement of Jordanian policy on non-participation in offensive military operations, but its timing relative to the Iraq notification was not accidental. Jordan has an American military presence and deep security dependence on Washington, which means this statement carries considerable political cost for Amman and was not made lightly. In that same week, the Lebanese Army Command issued a statement asserting Lebanese sovereign authority over Lebanese airspace in terms that, while technically routine, were timed and worded in a way that was understood in the regional diplomatic community as a signal about Lebanese willingness to facilitate Israeli or American operations in the Lebanese theater. The pattern across Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon in a single week suggests not spontaneous convergence, but active coordination. The most plausible coordination mechanism, according to analysis published in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Regional Brief, involves both Chinese and Iranian diplomatic facilitation operating through separate channels that produced aligned outcomes. That is not conspiracy theory. That is tracked diplomatic activity that multiple regional intelligence services have noted. Now let me address directly what the American media structure is not telling you. And the gap here is not merely editorial sloppiness. It reflects a structural inability to present a story that challenges the foundational premise of American strategic dominance in the region. That foundational premise is that American military power is so comprehensive, so technically superior, and so geographically flexible that no combination of regional actors can meaningfully constrain it. The corollary is that the military option, the ability to credibly threaten and, if necessary, execute military operations, is always available as the backstop of American diplomacy in the region. The airspace story is a direct challenge to that premise. Not because it makes American military operations impossible, they are not impossible, but because it makes them more difficult, more costly, more constrained, and therefore less credible as the backstop of a diplomatic position. Credible military deterrence depends on adversaries believing that you can execute what you threaten at a cost that is acceptable to you. When the geographic architecture of a potential military campaign begins to visibly erode, the credibility of the threat erodes with it. The Iraq decision, the Jordanian statement, the Lebanese signal, all of these are being communicated to every actor in the region right now, including Iran, including Hezbollah, including the Houthi movement, including the Iraqi popular mobilization units. They are being communicated as evidence that the geographic and political infrastructure of American military power in the region is contracting, not expanding, and that the window for operating under the assumption of American military omnipresence has closed. The sardonic dimension of this situation is that it is partly the product of American policy choices that were made with the expectation of different outcomes. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, the reduction of force posture in Iraq after 2011 and again after 2020, the failure to rebuild Iraqi institutional trust after the chaos of the post-203 period, the prioritization of maximum pressure confrontation with Iran over investment in Iraqi political relationships. All of these contributed to creating the conditions in which the Iraqi parliament can vote across sectarian lines to restrict American operations and find that it has the political and legal standing to do so. There is a historical parallel that illuminates the structural dynamic here. It is the Peloponnesian War, specifically the moment when Athens lost its geographic position in Sicily. The Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415 BCE was the overextension that began the terminal phase of Athenian strategic decline. Athens attempted to project military power into a theater it did not fully understand against a coalition of adversaries that had both local geographic advantage and external support from Sparta. The expedition failed catastrophically. When Athens returned to its core theater after that failure, it found that the resources and the strategic credibility it had consumed in Sicily had created vulnerabilities at home that it could no longer manage. The loss of one geographic position triggered a cascade that undermined the entire strategic architecture. Now, the loss of Iraqi airspace is not a Sicily moment in terms of scale, but it has the same structural character, a loss of geographic position that reveals and compounds underlying strategic overextension. Let me give you three possible paths forward from here. Path 1. The United States conducts an intensive diplomatic engagement with the Iraqi government, offers economic incentives, security guarantees, and political recognition sufficient to modify the airspace restrictions in ways that restore essential operational access. This requires Washington to treat Iraq as a genuine sovereign partner rather than a managed client state. That requires a significant shift in the political and bureaucratic culture of American Iraq policy. It is possible, but it requires acknowledging that the current approach has failed, and that acknowledgement is something no administration has been willing to make publicly. Path 2. The United States adapts its operational planning to the new geographic reality, invests heavily in aerial refueling capacity and basing agreements in alternative locations like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, and accepts a reduced but not eliminated military posture in the Eastern Theater. This is the path of managed adjustment. It preserves American military relevance while acknowledging the new constraints. It is the most likely near-term response because it does not require admitting strategic failure. It just requires spending more money on tankers and negotiating a few new basing memos. Path 3. The loss of Iraqi airspace combined with the other regional restrictions accumulating simultaneously produces an operational situation where the gap between American public rhetoric about keeping all options on the table and the operational reality of what the military can actually accomplish becomes so visible that it generates a political crisis about American credibility in the region. That crisis then forces a fundamental reassessment of the entire strategic posture, potentially including a significant drawdown or a complete reorientation of American strategy away from the Eastern Theater entirely. My assessment is that Path 2 is the most likely near-term response, but that Path 3 is the genuine strategic direction we are moving toward if the current accumulation of constraints continues for another 12 to 18 months. The entire American strategy in the Eastern Theater was built on geographic assumptions that are no longer valid. When the foundation changes, the structure above it cannot remain unchanged indefinitely. That is not pessimism, that is structural analysis. Tell me in the comments whether you think Washington can recover the Iraqi relationship on terms that restore meaningful airspace access. Tell me whether you see the Jordanian and Lebanese signals as genuinely coordinated or as opportunistic responses to the Iraqi action. The answers to those questions will determine how quickly the American strategic position in the Eastern Theater reaches its point of reckoning. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to track every development as it happens, because this story is not over. It is just beginning to be understood.